The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. John. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding about 100 liters. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the chief steward tasted the water that had become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servant who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they remained there a few days. The Gospel of the Lord. Well, this is the third week of our series, The Secrets of Every Happy Family. Probably not surprisingly, this series has already generated a lot of discussion among many families and maybe eventually amongst your own family. Admittedly, there are many secrets to success for happy families. We're looking at 3 in particular throughout our reflection. So just to review, the first secret of every happy family is that they accept the messiness of family life. Over and over again in our families, we're going to be running up against the flaws of one another. Happy families consistently choose to accept those flaws in each other with grace and flexibility. The second secret of every happy family is that they have mutual respect. Mutual respect creates an atmosphere of growth for everyone. And this begins with respect for God's authority over the whole of family life, and then the spouses' mutual respect for one another. The third secret of every happy family is a commitment to a larger purpose beyond themselves. Happy families know that their relationship's not just about themselves, but they serve a greater mission, a higher purpose in their extended family, in their neighborhood, in their community, and for our culture. Last week, we looked at the role fathers have in happy families. We said that dads have a unique role of providing blessing for their children. And we know this intuitively because we all look to our dads for approval and encouragement. Happy families have fathers who willingly step up to the plate and embrace that role. Today, we're looking at another role, the role that mothers play in the family. And obviously, I'm even less qualified to talk about this topic than I was last week, but that's never stopped me before. Now, don't worry. In shaping my reflection today, the feminine perspective has been consulted. Plus, we have Scripture. Just as last week we looked at Jesus' relationship with his Father in Scripture, this week, in today's Gospel, we're going to be looking at the relationship Jesus has with his mother. It is Luke's Gospel that tells us the most about Mary, but we get perhaps the most interesting snapshot into the relationship of Jesus and Mary in the Gospel of John. It is St. John who tells us the story that we heard today. There was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Now, pay attention to the order that John sets up for us here, because this order has a purpose. John puts the mother of Jesus first, and then Jesus, and then the disciples. We'll get back to this in a little bit. Mary, Jesus, and the disciples are at a wedding in a town called Cana, not too far from home. But it doesn't quite go as planned. At some point, we're told that Mary comes up to Jesus and informs him that they have run out of wine. Now, in those days, a Jewish wedding was a huge deal, lasting several days. The whole town would have been invited to partake in the ceremony and, of course, the feasting that followed. Hospitality in the Middle East was as huge a deal then as it is now for that culture. So running out of wine would have been a major embarrassment for that couple, bringing the party to an early end and casting a shadow over the prospects of their married life. Now, Mary must have known the couple well enough to have been privy to this problem. And it seems like maybe she was serving at the wedding too. So she brings the problem to Jesus, clearly expecting him to do something about it. Instead, he says this to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me?" If it sounds like Jesus is pushing back a little bit, it's because he is. But Mary, seemingly deaf to his response, you ever get that from your own mom? Seemingly deaf to his response, his mother says to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars, each holding about 100 liters. So Jesus tells the servants to fill them up with water. And they do that. They fill it right up to the brim. And then he tells them to draw some water out of it and take it to the head waiter. And so they do that. They take a sampling of this wine to the head waiter, who would have been in charge of the wedding service. And the head waiter tastes this water, which has now been made into wine, and he immediately calls the bridegroom over and he says to him, "Hey, everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine up until now." It seems that Jesus, like myself, appreciates a fine glass of wine. But in seriousness, this fine wine is a symbol of his abundance and his generosity. See, Jesus provides a superabundance, okay? Gallons and gallons of wine, equivalent to about 1,000 bottles of wine using modern day measurements. That is a lot of wine. Finally, in conclusion, John tells us this. After this, Jesus went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples. So, remember at the start of this when Mary was mentioned first? Well, now the order is switched around. Jesus is listed first, and then his mother, and then the others. Why? Well, when Mary tells Jesus about the lack of wine, it's not just about the lack of wine. She's doing something else here that is quite significant in the story of the gospel and in the arc of the life of Jesus. See, she knows her son through and through. While the Bible tells us that Jesus hadn't performed any miracles yet, she is well aware of what he is capable of, and she wants him to get started. But in performing this miracle, events will be set in motion that will lead to the cross. Jesus knows this, and he's checking with her to make sure she knows it too. He's not really hesitating. He's saying, "Do you really know what you're asking? Do you realize that this is going to change everything, including our relationship? Our relationship will be different." Up until this point, the Bible tells us that he spent his life in Nazareth and that he was obedient to her. But in making this request, Mary is changing the equation. She's releasing him from her authority. She's releasing him into the world to undertake his mission and his ministry. The roles have changed, and that can take some getting used to. I see this as a the sort of thing that all mothers eventually have to go through. Eventually, your kids will grow up and they'll have to move out. And from what I've learned, it can be extremely painful for mothers in particular, and it takes some adjustment, a huge one. Some mothers actually feel like they're losing a piece of themselves, and it hurts. Being a mom at that stage is vulnerability at its finest. Right after high school, my parents drove me up to Trent University to help me move in on Labor Day weekend. There I was getting ready to start this brand new chapter in my life, and I was excited. I was really excited. A little bit nervous too about what lies ahead, but thrilled nonetheless. And my mother seemed like her normal, happy self. She couldn't wait to get my room all set up, to put things in their place, right? Everything has its proper place. And I kept saying, Mom, it's okay. Go. Right? As I'm kicking things under the bed, literally, to get them out of there. But years later, actually not all that long ago, reflecting on that day, she told me that she cried the entire car ride home. Her oldest son wasn't a baby anymore, and I'd moved out. When she got home, she literally just stared into my empty bedroom. She was proud of me. I'm the first in our family to go off to university, so she's proud. But she was also incredibly heartbroken. But happy families are characterized by moms who understand that their role is one of preparation. They're preparing their kids for release into their own lives, in the same way that Mary released Jesus into his public ministry. But as Mary herself surely knew, this release is not just a one-time deal. It's going to happen in little ways, but it also happens in big ways too, over and over and over again, in an ever-expanding release until it is a complete release. Because moms are not raising children. They're raising adults. And as such, it's a pretty selfless role because good moms, great moms, are giving everything they have for their kids. And then they have to give their kids away too. Their very success brings about loss. And in a certain sense, it brings about sadness too. Sometimes it's a sadness that a mom must bear silently and all alone. And that just doesn't seem fair. It doesn't. But it must be so. For the success and the happiness of the family, it must be so. On the flip side of this story from St. John's Gospel, we see that happy families are also marked by respect towards the mother. Despite the distance of Jesus' words, in the end, he did exactly what his mother asked him to do. He honored his mother's request, and he did it in a generous and abundant kind of way. While the authority a mother has over her children eventually comes to an end, honor and respect should be permanent features of that relationship. In the Ten Commandments, God himself commands us to honor your father and mother that you may have a long life. It's actually the only one of the Ten Commandments that brings about a promise and a blessing of its own. That's how important this commandment is in the eyes of God. Of course, God says to honor both father and mother, but I think that especially happy families are marked by a special honor accorded to their mother. And that's because it was such a clear feature in Jesus' own life for the whole of his life. In fact, it is also in John's Gospel that we read that the very last thing that Jesus ever did was to make provision for the care of his mother. He did that from the cross. with virtually his last breath. So ladies, when it comes to application for moms, my question is this: are you parenting your child with God's purpose in mind? Are you parenting your child with God's purpose in mind? By which I mean, are you parenting knowing that eventually your job is to let them go, to release them into the world? Are you practicing that on a daily basis? Or are you holding on a little bit too tight? Are you trying to control everything, to know everything, and to be everything? Honestly, just ask yourself that question. If, on the other hand, your children are now adults, ask yourself if you are respecting their independence and their authority. Now, for the other members of the family, are you honoring the mother in your family? Now, that means a lot of different things at different stages of life. As an elementary or high school student, that requires obedience. Obedience in what you do, for sure, but also in how you talk to your mother, and the tone of voice that you use, the words that you choose, your body language, and your willingness to lend her attention. All of that is part of honoring your mother. And you might not like to hear it, but she actually gets it more than you think. If you're a young adult or newly married, it might mean giving time to that relationship and bringing your best game when you do that. Not acting like it's a sacrifice or some kind of imposition, but being generous with yourself in that relationship. If your mother is older, perhaps there is patience and kindness and care that is now required that maybe was not there previously in your relationship. If your mother is deceased, you can still honor her, and you should. Actually, you must, in your thoughts, in your prayers, and in your kind remembering of her. The family is an image and reflection of God's love. It's an imperfect reflection for sure, but it is a reflection. In fact, our frustration at its imperfection points us to our desire for something more. And our desire for something more is the family of God. Ultimately, what God is doing in the world is He's building up His family. And the very best thing about that is that we get to be a part of it. But here's the thing. We're supposed to be practicing now in our own family.